I stood there in my own home watching strangers toast to my sister-in-law. At the party I paid for, my name wasn't even on the cake, but when I picked up that mic, I didn't just give a speech. I told the truth they spent years trying to bury. If you've ever been overlooked, erased, or expected to stay quiet while others stole your spotlight, this story is for you. Let me tell you what happened, and why I no longer apologize for taking up space. If Ava's story already feels a little too familiar, don't scroll. Stick around. And if it moves you, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and join us next week for another story that deserves to be heard. The lake was still that afternoon, save for the occasional ripple that danced across its surface when the wind brushed past. It had rained the night before, and the air still carried the scent of pine and wet soil. Ava Taylor stood just outside the newly stained wood and glass double doors of her lake house, holding a small wrapped box in one hand, keys dangling from the other. Her heels pressed against the gravel, stilling, as her eyes caught sight of the white and gold banner strung across the front porch. "Congratulations, Riley and Kevin." The letters shimmered in the late spring sun, strung between two wooden beams that Ava had personally supervised during the house's renovation. A soft breath escaped her lips, not in shock, not in anger. Something quieter, something like clarity. She glanced down at the invitation in her inbox from just 2 weeks prior. Lakehouse housewarming, hosted by Ava Taylor. No mention of Riley, no mention of an engagement, and certainly no shared hosting. Inside the house, laughter rolled out through the open windows. Through the sheer linen curtains, Ava could see silhouettes of people moving between floral arrangements and champagne flutes. Tables were covered in pastel linens. She spotted her mother Gina in a cream-wrapped dress speaking animatedly to guests Ava barely recognized. Next to her, Martin, her stepfather, the man who had entered Ava's life when she was 14 and slowly shifted the gravity of the household, nursed a glass of scotch, nodding proudly. And in the center, radiant in a fitted pearl gray dress, stood Riley, Ava's half-sister, younger by 7 years. Riley with her arm tucked neatly into Kevin's, laughing as their hands danced atop a cake knife. Behind them stood a white and blush, two-tiered cake, RK Forever, piped in gold lettering. The scene might have been beautiful if it hadn't been built on someone else's foundation. Her foundation. Ava turned the doorknob and stepped in. The music didn't stop. The guests didn't pause. In fact, few even noticed her at first. She walked slowly, deliberately through the entryway she had designed to mirror a Nantucket inn. White oak floors, matte black fixtures. She had worked weekends for 3 years straight to afford this place. No investors, no partners, just her. Yet standing there watching strangers toasting to a love story that had eclipsed her own milestone, Ava realized just how invisible she still was. "Ava, you made it." Her mother spotted her wine glass in hand, moving through the crowd like a practiced hostess. Gina leaned in for a brief hug, one-armed, her lipstick perfectly intact. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come," she said brightly. Ava offered a measured smile. "Neither would I." "Isn't this just beautiful? Riley has been so overwhelmed lately with everything going on. We thought a small celebration would help ease the stress." "We?" Gina blinked. "Well, Martin and I. And Kevin, of course. You know how important this is to the family. It just felt right to hold it here." "Without telling me." Her mother's voice dipped slightly. "You've been so busy. We didn't want to bother you." Ava didn't respond. She looked toward the back patio where Riley now stood surrounded by friends. Riley, who had never held a job longer than a year, who once asked Ava if Excel was that green app with the dollar sign. "It looks lovely," Ava said calmly. "All of it." Gina seemed to relax. "I'm so glad you think so." Riley was really nervous about how it would look. But when she saw how we decorated the arch over the deck, "Oh, I almost forgot. The event planner added your name on the welcome board. It's by the guest book." Ava nodded. "Of course. Wouldn't want the owner of the house to be left out." "Oh, Ava." Gina laughed, missing the weight in her daughter's voice. "You always make things sound so serious. It's all love here. You know that." Ava didn't reply. Her gaze wandered over to the staircase where one of the guests was admiring the family photo wall. Her father's face, Ethan Taylor, was framed in the center, A moment of stillness passed through her chest. Then she turned back to Gina. I'm going to grab some air. Let me know when the speeches begin. Gina frowned just briefly before being swept into another conversation. Ava walked slowly toward the deck past smiles that weren't for her, and toasts that had nothing to do with her name. Out on the patio, she leaned against the railing. The lake glimmered quietly below. From her purse, she pulled out a folded note. It wasn't a speech. Not yet. Just a few sentences she'd scribbled during a sleepless night earlier that week. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's the space before a storm. Ava folded the paper back into her bag. She looked out over the water and breathed in. Inside the house, someone tapped a glass. She turned and walked back in. The scent of lemon oil and old pages always reminded Ava of the house she grew up in. Specifically, the second-floor hallway closet where her mother kept journals and keepsakes. That scent found her again years ago on an afternoon when she returned home during a college break, not to rest but to retrieve documents for a scholarship interview. It was the day she found the notebook. She hadn't meant to read it. She was looking for her high school transcripts, digging through drawers and labeled bins stacked in the guest room that used to be her bedroom. Her real bedroom, the one with south-facing windows and built-in bookshelves her father installed for her 10th birthday, had been repainted in pale lilac and filled with crib furniture. Riley had arrived 2 years after Ava's mother, Gina, married Martin Harrison. Riley was born in the spring, and so in some unspoken reshuffling of belonging, Ava was moved into the smaller guest room. Her things were boxed without her input. When she returned from a friend's house that day, her bookshelf had been dismantled and stored. The framed photo of her father on the desk replaced with a soft pink humidifier. There had been no confrontation, no dramatic explanation. Gina simply said, "Riley needs space. And you're growing up. It's time you learned to adjust." That was Gina's way. Gentle firmness layered over decisions already made. But Ava adapted. She always had. She learned not to ask questions to find solitude in early morning hours and long bus rides to the library. Her father had once told her that silence could be a form of strength. At the time, she believed him. Later, she'd realize he hadn't been talking about surrender. The notebook she found that day was bound in soft brown leather, its edges worn smooth. On the front page in her mother's looping script was written, "Riley, Year 1. Ava stood motionless for a long moment before flipping the page. The first entry was dated the week Riley came home from the hospital. She stretches her toes when she sleeps. Martin says she's a dreamer. I hope she always is. The next several pages chronicled Riley's feeding schedule, first words allergies. Then the tone shifted, less record-keeping, more reflection. Riley's laugh lights up the room. Sometimes I forget what it was like before she arrived. It's like she gave me a second chance to be whole again. That line stayed with Ava for a long time. She flipped faster then. Birthday memories, preschool drawings, a paragraph about Riley's stage fright before a Christmas recital, a photo tucked in the crease, Riley maybe 5 beaming in a red dress beside a Christmas tree. Nowhere in over 50 pages did Ava's name appear. Not a single line, not a single thought. The ache wasn't instant. It spread slowly like cold air under a door. Ava sat on the edge of the guest bed, the notebook resting open in her lap, and tried to understand whether she was surprised. She wasn't. By then, Ava had already accepted that her presence in the house had become conditional. She had been 14 when her father, Ethan Taylor, died of pancreatic cancer. Gina barely waited 6 months before Martin started visiting in the evenings. A year later, they were married in a small ceremony Ava wasn't invited to help plan. At school, she lied and said she had the flu that day. Martin was never cruel, not in words, but he treated Ava with the distant politeness one reserves for a house guest who has overstayed their welcome. Her thoughts were uninvited, her voice unnecessary. Over time, she stopped offering either. College became her escape. Princeton accepted her with a partial scholarship, but Gina and Martin declined to cover the rest. "We have Riley to think about," Gina had said. "And a state college is more practical for someone like you." Her grandparents eventually paid the tuition in full. That act alone was the only reason Ava made it through her undergrad years without breaking apart. Even now, she could recall the taste of that moment in the kitchen when her mother dismissed her future like a mismatched handbag. It wasn't anger Ava felt then. It was an old, cold realization becoming sharp again. She didn't belong here. She never really had. When Ava closed the notebook, she didn't cry. She simply returned it to the drawer right where she found it. And then she stood, walked into what used to be her room, and stared at the space where her father's shelf once stood. In its place was a white changing table. Later that evening, she ate dinner with the family, as if nothing had happened. She smiled when Riley spilled juice. She helped Martin carry in the groceries. And when she left that Sunday, she didn't say anything about the notebook. She never brought it up. Because deep down, Ava understood some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to be known. And that knowledge had started changing her even then. It was quiet, almost invisible. But it was the first thread of separation, the beginning of a boundary drawn not in defiance, but in grief. A silent line saying, "I see now. And I will never ask again." For nearly 2 years, Ava Taylor's name never showed up on a thank you card, but it appeared on every invoice that mattered. The payments started the way most obligations disguised as love do, quietly and without ceremony. One winter evening, a brief message from her mother arrived. "The heating bill's a little high this month. Riley's staying over a few nights. Could you help us out just this once?" Ava replied with a transfer of $347.89. No follow-up message. No acknowledgement. The silence was the thank you. The next month it was the water bill, then car insurance for Martin's sedan, which he said he needed to drive Riley to prenatal appointments. Riley wasn't pregnant. Ava paid anyway. After all, it was easier than arguing. And besides, she told herself, it's just temporary. But like all things in the Harrison household, temporary quietly turned into standard. By month 6, Ava had created a separate tracking spreadsheet on her personal laptop, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. She wasn't petty, she was a data analyst, and in the world of data patterns meant everything. Electricity, $128.54. Water, $74.20. Internet and cable under Ava's name, $189.99. 2 car repairs, $2, $340.77. Martin's dental work, $890. Gina's emergency vet bill for the dog Riley begged for, then forgot about $607.50. One refrigerator replacement, $120. By the end of year 1, the spreadsheet tallied just over $11,000. By the end of year 2, it neared $20,000. Not once did Gina ask if Ava was okay. Not once did Martin express concern over how she balanced the bills. And not once did either of them ask, "Do you have enough for yourself?" And still Ava kept sending money. She told no one. Not her colleagues, not Tiffany, her assistant, not even her grandparents. There was a part of her that still believed being useful was the only way she could stay tethered to a family that never really looked her in the eye unless she was solving something for them. Until one afternoon changed everything. It was early spring, and Ava had just wrapped a quarterly meeting with Global Insight's international team. As she walked back to her office, Tiffany greeted her with a magazine in hand. "You're going to want to see this." On the cover of Strategic Data and Leadership, Ava's face smiled back at her beneath the headline, "The Vision Behind Market Pulse, Meet Ava Taylor. The Quiet Force Redefining Predictive Analytics." It wasn't a flashy photo. No red carpet glamour, no overdone styling. Just Ava in her element. Clean lines, minimalist blouse, the Boston skyline behind her, and that look in her eyes that said, "I know what I'm doing." She sat down at her desk and flipped through the spread. It was a good piece. Thoughtful, fair human. The article mentioned her role in growing the company's valuation, building Market Pulse from a concept on a whiteboard to a billion-dollar solution used by over 60 firms globally. Ava's inbox buzzed. Congratulatory notes came in from old classmates, investors, even board members she rarely heard from outside quarterly updates. She waited for one message. It never came. Not from Gina, not from Martin, and certainly not from Riley. 2 days later, an email from her mother did arrive. The subject line read, "Can you help with something exciting?" No mention of the article. No mention of the cover. No. Saw the news. We're so proud. The body of the message was just 2 paragraphs. Riley was launching a boutique bakery and planned to hold a grand opening in May. They needed funding for signage, initial inventory, marketing materials, and rent deposit. "You've always been such a blessing," Gina wrote. "Just a small loan to help your sister start strong. We'll pay it back, of course." Ava stared at the screen, her fingers motionless over the keyboard. It wasn't the request that stung. It was the rhythm of it. The assumption. The seamless entitlement. As though her accomplishments only existed to be harvested for someone else's beginnings. She closed the laptop without replying. That weekend she drove to the lakehouse, the guest bedroom in the back, now fully renovated with a writing desk and a wide window that overlooked the shore, was where she sat and reviewed her spreadsheet again. Ava added one more entry. Line 62. Bakery proposal. Not paid. She saved the file under a new name, Family Receipts, for my own memory. From that day forward, Ava didn't stop giving. But she did start keeping track. And when the next bill came, she waited 3 days before paying. And the next one a week. Eventually, she stopped responding at all. Not with malice, with precision. It was the first time Ava allowed her generosity to be filtered through worth. Not their worth, but hers. Because love, she realized, wasn't about giving without limits. It was about knowing when to stop giving to people who never thought to ask how much it cost you to keep saying yes. The music had softened just enough for clinking glasses and murmured laughter to rise above the playlist. Ava moved through her lake house like a guest, not a host, trailing her fingertips lightly over surfaces she'd chosen herself. The marble countertop, the vintage bar cart she'd found at a weekend market in Hudson, the matte black light switches she'd spent 3 days debating over. Everything had been curated with care, and now it was wrapped in rose gold streamers and scattered with engagement-themed confetti. She took a slow breath and made her way to the kitchen, where a tray of hors d'oeuvres rested on a granite island. The catering team had done a beautiful job. She hadn't selected them. Near the back patio, her mother was laughing with 2 women in pastel dresses sipping wine, like she was born to play the role of event chair. Ava stepped closer. Gina turned mid-sentence. "Oh, there you are," she said, her voice warm, casual, like nothing at all was wrong. "I was hoping you'd come by the dessert table. You have to try the macarons." Riley requested the lavender flavor. So refined, don't you think? Ava studied her mother's face. No trace of guilt, no flicker of recognition that something might be off. "I thought this was a housewarming," Ava said quietly. Gina blinked but didn't pause long. "It is. It's both, really. Riley's engagement was such a happy surprise. We thought, why not combine the two, one celebration? It's more efficient that way." Ava's lips curled slightly. "Efficient?" Gina touched her arm lightly. "Sweetheart, I know you might feel surprised, but you've had so many accomplishments lately. The promotion, the Forbes piece. This house, you're doing wonderfully. Riley. Well, this is her first big moment. She needs it. She needs my house, my guest list, my money." That was the first time Gina hesitated. "You transferred the funds to help with the event," she said evenly. "I handled the details." Ava's tone didn't change. The invitation said, "Ava's housewarming," not Riley's engagement. "Well, we didn't want to make her nervous," Gina replied, voice soft, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. "And honestly, you know how your sister is. She can be sensitive. It would have meant the world to her to have something special for once. You have so much, Ava. You've already made it." Ava looked away for a moment toward the main room. Kevin was speaking with someone near the fireplace. Riley stood beside him, holding a champagne flute with both hands, her smile picture perfect beneath a canopy of twinkling lights. The guests clinked glasses, unaware that the woman who paid for their wine hadn't even been included in the planning. She turned back. "So the idea was to make this look like my celebration while it was actually hers." "Don't say it like that," Gina said quickly. "You're being dramatic." "No," Ava said, "I'm being accurate." There was a pause. the kind that stretched just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable if they'd been listening. But no one was. Anyway, Gina said recovering everything looks beautiful, doesn't it? That should matter too. We put a lot of thought into this. I even asked them to include your name on the welcome sign. Ava's eyes flicked toward the entrance. A wooden board rested on an easel there, scripted in pale pink chalk paint. A special celebration at the Taylor Lakehouse. Ava, Riley, and Kevin. Her name bundled in like an afterthought. I see, Ava said. She didn't yell, didn't demand the guests be informed of the switch, didn't storm out or throw wine or pull the plug on the speakers. She simply straightened her posture, took a breath, and said, I'll stay. And I'll give a speech later. Gina looked surprised. You will? Ava nodded. Of course. It's a special day after all. Her mother smiled, relieved. Good. That's good. As Gina drifted off, Ava walked back toward the window. The lake was calm again, the water reflecting the early evening sky like a mirror too honest for its own good. She could hear Riley's laughter behind her, bright and youthful, bouncing off the high ceilings of a house Riley hadn't lifted a single brick to build. Ava reached into her clutch and pulled out her phone. She opened her notes app, scrolled past project outlines and investment summaries, and tapped the file she'd started 2 nights ago. Speech draft, Lakehouse, first line. Thank you for being here today. This house has been a dream built from solitude, strategy, and silence. Her finger hovered over the screen, then tapped edit. She began typing, adding one more line before locking the phone again. Tonight, the silence ends. It wasn't revenge. She wasn't here to destroy anything. She was here to reclaim her own name spoken aloud under her own roof. And this time, she would not be quiet. The mic felt cool in Ava's hand. Lightweight, cordless, indifferent. The room was alive with chatter, glass clinks, and ambient music looping somewhere near the ceiling speakers. A few people were already drifting toward the dessert table, drawn to the camera-ready cake and floral centerpieces. Riley was laughing in the center of a semicircle, her left hand flashing the delicate engagement ring that sparkled under the chandelier Ava had paid extra to have imported from Italy. A staff member tapped the side of his glass. Once, twice. The sound rippled through the space like a pebble skipping across a lake. A hush followed. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, if I could have your attention for a brief moment, Ava Taylor, the host of this evening's celebration, would like to say a few words. Some scattered applause. A few polite nods. Riley clapped delicately, not quite hiding the hint of confusion that flickered across her face. Ava stepped forward, heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She took her place near the fireplace, just beneath the canvas painting she had chosen for this room, a quiet landscape of a single path winding through a forest. She looked out over the crowd, 50 people, maybe more, some familiar, most not, all gathered here in her home under a banner that bore someone else's name. She lifted the mic. Thank you, Ava said, her voice steady. I know many of you are here to celebrate something special, a milestone, a commitment, a moment of joy. And it's true. There is something to celebrate tonight. She smiled briefly, letting her gaze drift toward Riley and Kevin, who stood side by side in the crowd. But first she continued, I'd like to share a few things you might not know about the space you're standing in. The room quieted further. Somewhere in the back, a glass was set down with more care than usual. This house, Ava said, was not gifted to me. It was not inherited. It didn't come from a trust fund or a generous spouse. I bought this place after nearly a decade of 80-hour weeks, after 2 economic downturns, and after being told, repeatedly, that I was too quiet to lead. She let the words settle, then added, and when I transferred $4,000 to my mother to help plan a small housewarming celebration, this was not the event I had in mind. Murmurs. I was told, she said, that Riley needed this more than I did, that I had enough, that I was already successful. And perhaps that's true. But what I didn't have, until now, was a room full of people who might finally hear my version of this story. She paused just long enough to make eye contact with her mother, who stood stiffly near the bar. Martin hovered beside her, jaw clenched. When I was 14, Ava said my father died. 6 months later, Martin moved in. 1 year after that, my room, my books, My memories were boxed up to make space for a new baby, a new life, Riley's life. She turned her head slightly toward her sister. This is not a complaint, Ava added. It's simply the context I was never allowed to share. No one moved. I paid the electricity when it was about to be shut off. I paid the car insurance when Martin's policy lapsed. I covered the vet bill for the dog Riley wanted and forgot about. And when Riley wanted to open a bakery, I was asked to invest. Not because I was passionate about pastries, but because I was reliable. She smiled again. This time the kind of smile that was almost too quiet to be called anything but honesty. I gave Ava said, not because I was asked nicely, not because I was loved in return, but because for a long time I thought that's what daughters do. Even the invisible ones. The room was frozen. And yet she said, glancing around when I arrived today, at my own home. I wasn't greeted as a host. I wasn't acknowledged as the person who built this life from nothing. I was background. A soft breath in. Then I'm no longer interested in standing in the background. Gina took a step forward, her face pale. Ava, she said low and sharp. I think that's enough. Martin's voice followed louder, harsher. This isn't the place for this. You're making a scene. Ava turned her gaze to him, unwavering. No, she said calmly. I'm making a statement. Martin stepped toward her. You need to leave. She tilted her head, studying him, like one might a stranger stepping across a line. If anyone should leave this house, she said evenly, it certainly isn't me. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was seismic. It rolled across the floorboards, past the buffet table, and the guest book, out through the windows and into the air above the lake. Riley looked at Kevin. Kevin looked away. In the stillness, Ava clicked the mic off and set it gently on the mantel. Then, without raising her voice, without slamming a door, she turned and walked toward the kitchen. It was her house, and she had just taken it back. For a moment, no one moved. Ava's words still hung in the air like a bell's final chime. Low, reverberating, impossible to ignore. Gina stood stiff, arms folded across her stomach, her eyes darting toward the kitchen where Ava had disappeared. Martin remained rooted near the center of the room, shoulders squared as if he were holding the house itself together with posture alone. Riley looked stunned, her face tight with disbelief, blinking rapidly like she had just emerged from underwater. Then softly a voice cut through the silence. I think it's time we added something, Frank Taylor said. All eyes turned. Ava's grandfather stepped forward from the far end of the room, his posture straight despite the years in his frame. Helen walked beside him, quiet as ever, but with her hand wrapped firmly around his arm. Frank cleared his throat, not for dramatic effect, but because decades of teaching had trained him to command attention without raising his voice. We've listened long enough, he said, looking directly at Gina. Now it's time we speak. Gina opened her mouth, then hesitated. It had been years since her father-in-law had addressed her with that tone, measured, quiet, final. Frank continued. 3 months ago, Helen and I updated our will. We didn't do it out of spite. We did it because we've been watching. His eyes moved to Ava, who had returned and now stood near the edge of the crowd. Arms at her sides, gaze steady. All of our assets, Frank said, including the house in Cambridge, the investment accounts, and the family trust, will go to Ava. A collective gasp swept through the room like a dropped glass shattering in slow motion. Helen nodded gently. It's not about money. It's about integrity, she said. And we've seen who has it. Gina's face drained of color. Dad, what are you talking about? You made your choice, Gina. Frank replied, years ago. And you reinforced it again tonight. Riley stepped forward now, her expression shifting from confusion to fury. This is ridiculous, she snapped. She's been bitter for years. Of course she put on a show. You're falling for it. Kevin looked at her then. Really looked. Put on a show. Riley turned, her voice rising. You don't know her like I do. She's always had this need to be the center of attention. She's jealous. Always has been. I don't think she's jealous, Kevin said quietly. Riley froze. I think she's tired, he added. He looked at Ava, and the expression on his face was something Ava hadn't expected. Not pity, but realization. A dawning understanding that the story he had been told about Ava Taylor was missing chapters. I didn't know, he said, about any of this. No one did, Ava replied softly. That's how it's always been. Riley's voice turned shrill. You're trying to ruin everything. You couldn't just let me have one day? Ava didn't flinch. I let you have a decade. Helen took a step closer. Riley, she said gently, this isn't about one day. It's about every day that came before it. But she embarrassed us in front of everyone, Gina interjected. No, Frank said. She told the truth. You just didn't like how it sounded out loud. Riley looked around the room, eyes scanning for allies. But the guests, the ones who had applauded earlier, who had clinked glasses and cooed over the engagement ring, stood in stiff silence. They weren't looking at her. They were watching Ava. And Ava. She looked calm, not triumphant, not vengeful, just done. Martin finally spoke. This is outrageous. This house is filled with people who came to celebrate us. No, Ava said. They came because they were invited under my name, to my house, using my money. Martin opened his mouth again, but no words came. Riley gave a bitter laugh. You think this makes you better than us? No, Ava replied. It just proves I never needed to be. She turned to her grandparents. I'm ready to go. Frank and Helen nodded. Without another word, Ava slipped her hand through her grandfather's arm. Helen looped her arm gently through Ava's other side. They walked slowly toward the front door, past the catered bar and the dessert table, past the frozen stairs and half-finished sentences. As Ava reached for the door handle, she glanced back one last time. Riley stood in the center of the room alone, her hands clenched into trembling fists. Gina sat down heavily on the edge of the couch, looking at no one. Martin stared out the window as if the lake might give him an answer. The house behind them wasn't loud. It didn't collapse with a crash. It folded inward quietly, like a mask slipping from a tired face. And Ava, who had once believed silence was survival, now walked into the night with her voice intact. This time it wasn't about being heard. It was about no longer needing permission to leave. 3 years passed. The lake house stood exactly as it had that night, but inside everything had changed. The chandelier still caught the morning light. The oak floors remained smooth beneath bare feet. The painting by the fireplace, the one of the solitary path through a quiet forest, had never come down. But now the house felt inhabited, not staged. Its stillness wasn't the silence of erasure. It was the peace of someone who no longer needed to be seen to feel real. Ava Taylor had become the youngest CEO in Global Insight's history. The announcement had come quietly without a press conference or a champagne-soaked boardroom celebration. Daniel Wu, the retiring CEO, had made the decision himself. He walked into her office one Friday afternoon with a short list in one hand and a retirement speech in the other. You're not the loudest voice in the room, he told her, but you're the one who listens before anyone else realizes what matters. Ava thanked him with her usual restraint, but later, when the office emptied, she sat in the quiet and allowed herself to feel it. Not pride exactly, but release. She had climbed a mountain most people didn't even know existed, and now she stood at the top not to wave a flag, but to finally breathe. Instead of buying a larger home or a second car or a luxury watch, Ava did something no one expected. She founded the Ethan Taylor Foundation. It started with a single donation. Hers. Then she partnered with a community college in New England. Then a nonprofit in Chicago. The foundation's mission was simple but deeply personal: support educational access for young people who had been abandoned, overlooked, or burdened by their families of origin. She never told Riley. She never had to. The foundation's first scholarship recipient was a 19-year-old girl named Mariah, whose parents had moved away without telling her, leaving her with unpaid bills and a part-time job at a diner. Mariah's essay ended with a line that made Ava pause the first time she read it. I'm not asking for someone to save me, I just want the chance to save myself. That line went into the foundation's mission statement. Ava's days were full now, but not in the same way they used to be. Meetings, yes. Strategic reviews, product launches, quarterly forecasts. But also Saturday mornings on the deck playing chess with Frank, who still insisted on narrating his moves like a sports commentator. Late afternoons steeping herbs with Helen, who swore by her lemon balm and sage blend for both memory and mood. Walks through the garden behind the lakehouse, which Ava kept mostly wild. She liked that some things didn't need pruning to be beautiful. She hadn't spoken to her mother since that night. There had been no apologies, no attempts to reach out that weren't veiled in some new request. Eventually, the silence became less a wall and more a boundary, one Ava no longer needed to explain or defend. Martin retired early after a quiet departure from his firm. Riley's engagement to Kevin dissolved 6 months after the party. From what Ava heard through a distant cousin, Riley had moved back home and was now teaching Pilates part-time. Ava didn't feel vindicated. She felt nothing at all, and that perhaps was the most peaceful outcome. Some evenings she sat by the lake with a book she didn't finish, watching the sun fall behind the trees. She no longer waited for a phone call, a message, a moment of reconciliation that would rewrite the past. She had let go of that hope, the way one lets go of a balloon into the sky. Not out of spite, but because she was no longer interested in holding something that kept pulling upward while she remained rooted below. When journalists asked her how she found the strength to succeed in a male-dominated industry, her answer surprised them. "I didn't succeed to prove anything to anyone," she said. "I succeeded because I stopped trying to be someone my family could finally approve of." She never named them. She didn't need to. The people who mattered knew the truth. And the ones who didn't. They weren't owed an explanation. One quiet Sunday, as autumn began painting the treetops gold, Ava stood on the deck beside her grandfather. "You always move your queen too early," Frank said, studying the chessboard. "I like taking risks," Ava replied. He laughed. "You like precision disguised as risk. There's a difference." She smirked and made the move anyway. Helen brought out tea and clay mugs she'd made during her last pottery class. The steam curled up like a promise that warmth could come even after long seasons of cold. Ava looked out over the lake. For a long time she had believed survival required silence. Then she had believed it required speech. Now she understood it only required space. The kind she had built, earned, and protected. And in that space, she wasn't a title, or a daughter, or a cautionary tale. She was Ava, and that was enough. The knock came just after noon, soft but deliberate. Ava had been in the kitchen slicing lemons for tea when she heard it. 3 raps followed by silence. Not a delivery, not a neighbor. That kind of knock carried history. She dried her hands, slowly, heart quiet, not anxious. She already knew. When she opened the door, there they stood. Gina wore pearl earrings and a beige cardigan draped too carefully over her shoulders. Her lipstick was fresh, the same shade Ava remembered from her teenage years. Martin stood beside her, arms, crossed, chin slightly lifted, as if preparing to present a case. "Ava," Gina said, managing a practiced smile. "Hi, sweetheart. Do you have a moment?" Ava studied their faces, more tired than before, less sure of themselves. She stepped aside without a word. They walked into the living room like visitors at a museum, cautious, reluctant to admit how long it had been. Gina looked around, pausing near the window. Martin hovered near the edge of the couch but didn't sit. Ava stood, arms loosely crossed, grounded and waiting. Gina cleared her throat. We've been thinking. Martin's retirement was earlier than planned. And I've had some unexpected health bills." Ava said nothing. Gina pressed on. "We were hoping you might consider helping. Just something small. $2,000 a month. To help with living expenses insurance. Aging's expensive." Martin chimed in. "It's not much. Not for someone in your position." Ava's face remained still. "Why now?" Gina blinked. "We thought, since you're doing well." "No," Ava said gently. "Why now?" After years of silence. "Why today?" Martin stepped forward. "Because we're being honest. Because we're asking directly instead of pretending." Ava turned, walked to the bookshelf, and returned with a manila folder. She placed it on the table between them. "I drafted this last year," she said, "just in case this ever happened." Gina furrowed her brows. "What is it?" a formal contract outlining the terms of monthly support, and a clause reassigning the remaining value of any future estate, house savings, everything, to me. Riley would be excluded. Gina's expression hardened. You want us to sign away our home? I want transparency, Ava replied. And fairness. Martin's voice sharpened. That's absurd. No, Ava said calmly. What was absurd was watching you hand over my bedroom, my education, and my father's memory to someone else without ever looking back. That's not true, Gina whispered. We did the best we could. Ava's jaw tensed just slightly. No, you did what was convenient. She looked directly at her mother. When Dad died, I didn't expect you to stay broken, but I never thought you'd erase me to feel whole again. Gina's face flushed. That's not fair. It's not about fair, Ava said, voice steady. It's about facts. I gave you a home. Gina snapped. Food, clothes. We raised you. And I paid you back. Ava replied. Quietly. Without interest. Over and over again. Martin folded his arms tighter. You're being vindictive. No, Ava said, her tone still soft. I'm being honest. She moved to the window, gazing out toward the lake. I've written checks when your water was shut off. Paid for car repairs, vet bills, Riley's bakery launch. You never asked how I was doing. You never wondered what it cost me. She turned back. And now you come here. Not to apologize, not to reconnect, but to invoice me again. Gina's voice trembled. We thought you might want to help. We thought you loved us. Ava's eyes darkened. Not with anger, but with a kind of old exhaustion. I've already paid, not in money, but in years spent living like I didn't exist. The words landed like a stone in deep water. No one moved. No one spoke. Where Riley blew out candles while I cleared the dishes. I've been loyal, I've been silent, and I've been forgotten. Martin opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Ava returned to the table and closed the folder. You don't have to sign. I'm not demanding anything. Gina's hands shook slightly as she reached for her purse. We made mistakes, Ava, but this is harsh. You're still our daughter. Ava's voice softened, not with forgiveness, but with finality. You raised a daughter who learned to live without being seen. Don't be surprised if she no longer feels the need to stand in your frame. They left soon after. No hugs, no reconciliation, just the quiet sound of the front door closing behind a chapter that had long since ended. Ava didn't watch them drive away. She poured herself a cup of lemon balm tea and stepped out onto the deck. The wind was gentle. The lake was calm. Across the chessboard, her grandfather's last move remained untouched. Bishop to e5. He always said it was a good endgame strategy, protect the heart, control the center. Ava sat back in her chair and smiled to herself. No inheritance would ever feel better than this. She had finally stepped out of the picture. And this time, she didn't leave an empty space behind. If you've ever been the one who gave without being seen, if you've ever been expected to sacrifice but never celebrated, if you've ever stood quietly on the sidelines while others danced in the spotlight you lit for them, then maybe Ava's story feels a little bit like yours. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't demand apologies that would never come. She simply chose something most of us forget we're allowed to choose: freedom. So now we ask you, have you ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to hold you close? Have you ever built yourself back from the silence someone else left you in? And more importantly, what did you discover when you stopped waiting to be chosen and started choosing yourself? We'd love to hear your story. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear tonight. If Ava's journey resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Tap the bell icon so you won't miss the next story. Because sometimes the most powerful transformations begin in the quietest places. Thank you for listening. We'll be back soon, with another voice, another truth, another chance to see yourself. Maybe for the first time.